Welcome back to The Fix. Of course, here on this program, we like to dig deep. And Sunday Times columnist Peter Bruce now joins me in conversation as we, of course, interview and continue with the conversation with Minister of Economic Development, Ibrahim Patel. Peter, good evening. Welcome as always.
Thank you.
Have a go at the minister.
Well, I don't want to have a go at him, but I do want to remind you of a time in 2009, the night the cabinet was being announced, and you were the political editor on Business Day, and I was the editor, and you rushed into my office because there was one last cabinet post that had been announced, and it was Ibrahim Patel.
Yes, I wrote that story.
Yeah, you wrote it. I know exactly where we put it. We put it in the middle of the front page. So we've been, we've been following you for a long time. But just to what you've done now, you've introduced two basic new powers, I suppose, to the sort of competition authorities. One is to look at concentration of industries, not just whether they are colluding or, but the sheer fact of their size and their concentration. And the other one is to use the national interest, to bring the national interest into certain mergers or acquisitions that may or may not, in the view of a panel, be good for the country. And that's not unusual. I think the Canadians have done that recently with some big attempted mergers with Canadian companies, and I think the Australians do it as well. But concentration's got to be a problem in this economy, Minister, because we're not big, and so we tend to sort of make there's small groups of banks and small groups of retailers. I'm not sure what else there are small groups of, but partly they survive because they do their job well. We don't know whether banks collude. They all seem to have the same sort of charges, the same interest rates. But how do you make room for other banks?
Well, Peter, first, thank you. I think we distinguish in competition law between abuse of dominance, and we've put in further amendments to strengthen the hand of the regulator to deal with things like price discrimination and excessive pricing. And then there's a second category, which is the area of economic concentration. I've made the point to Karima earlier that concentration is a complex issue because sometimes it's the outcome of the pursuit of other legitimate economic objectives. Economies of scale can help consumers. When you have national champions that go aggressively out on global markets, they often result in large operations in South Africa. But at the same time, concentration can serve as a means of exclusion. People have sewn up a market. You don't have space for new entrants, small businesses, black South Africans, fresh investment. So in the law, what we did was we looked at the international experience, and we've come up with what we think is an appropriate and nuanced mechanism that we will use a market inquiry. Large firms will be able to say, yes, we are large, yes, we dominate in the South African economy, but our domination of the economy in the sector does not result in the exclusion of small players or medium-sized companies. And it's that mix, that ability to ensure that we bring small and medium enterprises, new players and black South Africans in, that will be the heart of future market inquiries.
Is competition policy the way to do this? I mean, is it the right vehicle to use to run economic policy? I know it's certainly the power that you have in your department gives you enormous clout over the economy. But I wonder whether there aren't limits to competition policy as such, being the gearbox of
the equalizer, if you like. Yeah.
I think if we were to rely only on competition policy, fair point, we're not going to be able to achieve the economic inclusion because by its nature, on its own, it's not going to achieve that. But as part of a wider toolbox, our work shows that it's an essential element of it. So I'm going to use the question of small business development. Many small businesses currently are affected by something called price discrimination. It's when a large supplier offers different prices to large customers and small customers. Now, they may say there's an economic rationale to it. Fair enough. But if the result of that is small players are essentially excluded from the economy, society stands up and says, we can't accept those kind of outcomes. Now, there's a competition element to that, competition policy element. But if you do that, the state also has to ensure that its licensing regime, its support for small business, unnecessary red tape, all those other elements are addressed. It's when you put a package of measures together that you can begin to get the outcomes that you want. So I take the point that on its own it's not going to be sufficient, but it is a necessary element of what we seek to do.
Minister, I want to come in here. I mean, the Act or the legislation seeks to empower those who've been excluded. You've categorized them. In large measure, we're talking about black South Africans, we're talking about women, we're talking about young people. What I want to understand, though, is that when people have been included, the deals haven't always been sound, both from a business perspective, from an ethical perspective. How are you going to prevent this legislation from being abused, where we have a select group of people who have political collectivity using this legislation to access deals that perhaps better players in the same categories could have come to the party with?
Karima, the model of empowerment we have at the moment essentially works on the basis that there's an enormous amount of lobbying to get 10% or 20% or 30% of the shareholding of an existing company given to black South Africans. And then the fear, the concern that society has is, does proximity to decision makers give you a leg up and an easier entry? The bill, the new law, the new legislation takes a completely different view. It says we've got to promote new enterprises, getting black South Africans to start up businesses. And those businesses, we need to ensure that you don't have exclusionary conduct by the large players. So essentially, we're trying to build here the universe of enterprises, real entrepreneurs.
When we talk about enterprises, you know, we have a small business minister, and we all take small business very seriously. Nobody stands up and ever gives a speech about the economy without small business being mentioned. But while we talk about the importance of small business, we also have this thing called insourcing, resurfacing. So where stuff was outsourced to small businesses, we're now seeing our universities and hospitals and whatever, they've all got to insource everybody again, and the opportunities for small business players to service big companies or big institutions are actually being reduced rather than being increased by insourcing.
Well, I think, Peter, the insourcing issue is a bit more complex than probably we can cover tonight.
Yeah.
You may well want to have a whole episode of the fix looking at it. And then I'd be happy to come if you can't find anyone else on it. Because the concern of the state has been that we've often overpaid with the outsourcing model. It was really, the initial idea is that it could in fact enable the state to better utilize its resources. But it's been a challenge. But coming back to the competition law.
But Minister, before we do that, the point I think that I want to latch onto what Peter's saying is, you've got your set of objectives with this legislation, right? Then you've got other economic cluster ministers dealing with legislation to do all the same thing, which is to build an inclusive economy that benefits the majority. But you yourself have said sometimes these things bump up against each other. To what extent has this piece of legislation been understood in relation to the rest of your cabinet colleagues that have their own imperatives, and how are you going to govern cooperatively?
Look, that's really the heart of it.
Yeah.
And what President Ramaphosa, and he's a very strong supporter of the legislation, what he's really asked us to do in cabinet is find coordinated, joined up ways in which we achieve economic inclusion. And so together with this measure, there are a range of other measures that will now be coming through, and you'll see how we try to achieve this coordination. I'll give you perhaps an example of how we're seeking to do that. At the moment, small businesses have two problems. It's the demand side, which is how to get orders in the economy. And then there's the supply side, how to get access to capital, to trained workers and so on. This deals with the demand side issue. And it will ensure that they're not effectively blocked from access to markets. But if we don't get the supply side right also, which is access to capital, access essentially to well-trained workers, and those other critical elements, then it's not going to be sufficient.
Minister, we have to take a short break. We'll, of course, come back with the fix. Don't go anywhere.